Welcome back. So for this flat iron tuning tech tip, we're getting close to being done in the engine bay of our 335i project car. And one of the last things to go back on was the airbox. So we had to decide, well, do we want to put the stock airbox back on, or do we want to put on some kind of an intake? And we realized that it's a perfect opportunity to kind of go through the criteria that we used to decide if we wanted to put on an aftermarket intake, and if so, which one. So if you're thinking about putting an intake on your car, the very first thing to do, the starting point, is just head out to your engine bay, head out to your car, pop the hood, look at your engine bay, take a look at your stock airbox, and look and see if you see any kind of sensors, any kind of wires going to it, or specifically a mass airflow sensor that is part of your stock airbox. If you do, then what you need to know is, has any are there aftermarket intakes available for your car? You can take the stock gearbox out and replace it with an aftermarket intake and still maintain the calibration of the stock mass airflow sensor. If you do have a mass airflow sensor and there are intakes that are designed that do not need custom calibration, that's a big plus, and that would probably be the one you'd want to pick. If not, if there's nothing available, then that's something to consider as far as whether now is the right time to do the intake or not. Perfect example would be the Subaru WRX and STI. So this is the airbox off of our 03 WRX, and on the WRX and STI from 2002 to 2007, this airbox was such, and mass airflow placement was such that aftermarket companies like Cobb and some others were able to design an intake that matched the calibration, matched the flow rate of the mass airflow sensor, so that you did not need any kind of custom tune to run this safely and to get a benefit for it. So what that means is you can just bolt it on, you don't need a custom tune, and the car will run properly. But then in 2008, basically from 2008 to present, Subaru redesigned their airbox such that where the mass airflow sensor was, there is no company that we're aware of to date that has been able to design an intake that does not require custom calibration. So if you're going to need a tune, first thing is, hopefully you've got something like an AccessPort, and maybe Cobb has come up with a map for their intake or somebody else's intake, so you can still just buy it, put the proper map on your car, and then run the intake safely. If not, if you have to get a tune to get the car to run properly and safely with the intake, because you're changing the calibration of the mass airflow sensor, you have to decide, well, does it make sense to do the intake now or not? Because if it's $300 for the intake, $400 for the tune, that's a lot more expensive investment than just the intake by itself. And sometimes in those cases, what makes the most sense is to put that on the shelf and wait until you're doing other mods that also require tune, like going to 85, bigger injectors, bigger turbo, something like that, so that you can get the best benefit for paying for a tune, because you're putting on the maximum number of parts that require the tune. You're getting the car tuned just once instead of at each iteration. So so beyond that, so once you decide can you put one on or not, there's really two different styles of intakes. There's a short rim intake, and there's something called a cold air intake. So short rim intake is the simplest. That's what this Cobb SF intake is at its core. It's something where you take the stock airbox, you take all of this box and complexity out and replace it with a simple tube or fitting that holds the mass airflow sensor and that goes to a filter. And there's some certainly benefits for this design. The biggest one is that it's small, it's compact, and you can, it's very versatile. You can put this in a lot of different locations. And sometimes that's, that mobility is the reason you pick something like this, because like in a Subaru, if you're putting a front mount intercooler on the car that didn't come with it, you can't route the front mount piping around the stock airbox, so you need something small and compact like this. You can move it around, put it where it needs to be, so that so you can fit the plumbing around it. With the short rim intake, where you're picking up performance potentially is because you're taking away a lot of the plumbing that feeds the stock airbox, possibly the restrictions in the airbox itself, and basically just putting in a more free-flowing filter that's open to the engine bay. So you're reducing the restriction of the air to get into the engine. So that's typically where you're picking up efficiency with this. The downside with the short rim intake that you have to keep in mind is temperature. So when you're putting a filter in the engine bay, you're now pulling in air that's the temperature of the engine bay, not the outside. And the very rough rule of thumb is for every 10 degrees increase in inlet temperature, you're losing 1 horsepower. So if you're gaining because you're reducing the restriction of the air to get into the engine, and maybe you're picking up, say, 5 horsepower, but now it's 60 degrees outside, but this is sitting in the middle of your engine bay and you're pulling in 160-degree air, you're actually losing more power than you're making by putting on this intake. The other footnote to that is because you're in the engine bay, if it's not protected, if it's not isolated in any way, then the inlet temperature is going to fluctuate a lot more. You know, if you're sitting in traffic, sitting in a stoplight, no air is moving and you're just basically heating up the intake charge, then you start moving and everything starts cooling off, there's going to be a lot more fluctuation in that inlet temperature versus something like a cold air intake. Okay, so what is a cold air intake? The typical example of that goes back to their origin, which was where the goal was to take this filter and put it as far out of the engine bay as possible to make sure that you're pulling in temperatures close to the outside temperature or ambient temperature as you can. So what that usually involved is taking the stock airbox out, replacing it with, you know, in some cases a long tube of piping that would then put your filter, you know, behind a headlight, down in a fender well, or maybe even behind the front bumper. Again, the goal was to put the filter as far out of the engine bay as possible to make sure you're pulling in air as close to ambient temperature as possible. Makes sense because it's fixing kind of one of the big downsides of a short ram intake. But cold air intakes have a problem, or kind of some problems as well. The biggest one is if you can't see or get to the filter easily, that can be a real problem. I can't tell you how many times over the years we've seen cars that come in where you've got a filter that's tucked way behind the bumper that takes a lot of effort to get to. And you know, if we finally get in there and we see that this filter is just gummed up with leaves and dirt and mud and gunk, and if you can't make sure that the filter is clean or clean the filter regularly, you're losing everything you're gaining from having that cold air intake on, just like with a short ram with a hot engine bay. The other problem is water. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen where, you know, kind of the worst case scenario for a cold air intake where you've really remotely mounted the filter is you would, you know, partially or fully submerge the filter in water. Because if the engine is spinning, it's pulling, you know, pulling air, but if it can't pull air and the filter is submerged, it's going to be pulling water. And that can be a really bad day. So those are some of the big downsides. Now, what has happened because of that over the years is some companies have fixed that. One of the first one was CT Engineering, but a lot of other companies have followed suit, where you take something like a simple short ram design, but then you isolate it in the engine bay. So like for Cobb, for example, because we've got it right here, take the simple short ram and then you put it behind some kind of an air box. So if you can isolate the short ram filter in the engine bay and then duct air to the box so that it's basically ambient temperature air, you're kind of getting the best of both worlds. And so in a lot of ways, that's kind of the ideal if that's available for your car. So now we're going to dive into the intake that we picked for the BMW and give some more details as far as how we came to that conclusion. Okay, so when it came to picking an intake for our 335i project car, it was actually a pretty hard choice. You can guess from the first part of this video, what we wanted was something that was the ideal. An ideally designed cold air intake that kept the filter itself in the engine bay, but isolated and ducted so that it was pulling in as close to ambient temperature, as close to outside temperature as possible. And honestly, if you look at the stock airbox, that's basically what BMW did. This car has a lot of ducting that basically pulls air right from the front of the car and leads it right into the airbox, and then from the airbox straight into the turbos. Now, one advantage we had is BMW did not put a mass airflow sensor in this part of the airbox. So pretty much the design was wide open as far as how to try and improve on this. The one window that BMW kind of left open for improvement was the path that the air can make or has to make once it gets into the airbox. The ducting is great. There's a really good volume that intake charge fills. There's a really large filter that it goes through. But once the air goes through the filter, there's this very small volume at the top, kind of this triangular area that the air has to sit in and then move all the way forward before it can reach the chamber where it gets pulled into the turbos. So there's definitely some room for improvement there, and that's where we started looking around at options. And what we ended up with was this AFE Momentum GT intake, because it basically checked all of our boxes. It retains all of the stock ducting that goes into their box, which does isolate the filter in engine bay just like we had hoped for. It has a very large oval air filter that fills up this box, or that sits in the box, and then it has, you know, this nicely designed path once the air gets past the filter down to each turbo. So the other aspect that we really liked was the fact that they even put a window on there. So all you have to do is open the hood and look down, and you can see, if the filter needs to be cleaned, etc. So it's a really nice design that keeps all of the positive aspects of the stock airbox, but with the added benefit of having a less restrictive path that the air has to go through to get into the engine. So that's where we're hoping that we're going to pick up a little bit of a benefit here. We've done some other things to the car as well, being under the hood, and in addition, that you haven't seen yet, we've also put a bigger front mounted intercooler on the car too. So for this car, the next step is to put it back on the dyno and see what we picked up with all these changes. But thanks very much for watching. Hopefully you've enjoyed how far we've gone with the car so far, and stay tuned because there's still more to come. And hopefully you found this video helpful as far as if you're trying to pick an intake, what are some of the criteria, what to look for. So if you found this video helpful, please do drop a like. Thanks very much for your support. We truly do appreciate it, and stay tuned for more Flatiron's Tuning Tech Tips.